Imagine you're a night guard, the only soul in a vast, silent building. You glance at the security monitors and see yourself on screen, except you're not in your chair. You're in the deepest part of the warehouse, and you're not just standing there. You are desperately, silently screaming for your life. And the only person who can see you is you. The 27th of November, 2025. A single, weak lamp cast a sickly yellow glow over the security console, leaving the rest of the small room in deep shadow. The only sound was the low, electric hum of the equipment, a constant drone against the profound silence of the empty supermarket. He took another sip of his coffee, the cold, bitter liquid doing little to stave off the encroaching drowsiness. The night stretched on, each minute crawling by with the thick, deliberate slowness of melting wax. This was the rhythm of his world, a predictable and lonely beat. His gaze drifted across the grid of black and white monitors, a patchwork of silent, lifeless scenes. Aisle 3, with its rows of colorful cereal boxes now just shades of gray. The deli counter, its stainless steel surfaces gleaming under the harsh overnight lights. The toy section, where the fixed smiles of dolls seemed eerie and vacant in the monochrome feed. His eyes scanned them out of habit, not expectation. For months, these screens had shown him nothing but the quiet geometry of an empty building, a tomb of commerce waiting for the dawn. It was on screen 7 that the pattern broke. A flicker in the frozen foods section, so brief it was barely registered, a smudge of movement at the edge of his vision. It was nothing, and yet it was everything, a single discordant note in a long, monotonous symphony. He blinked, unsure if he had truly seen it or if his tired eyes were finally manufacturing ghosts from the shadows. The image had been a blur, a shapeless, fleeting darkness that had no reason to be there amidst the frost-covered glass doors and the sterile white floor. He leaned forward, the worn fabric of his chair groaning in protest. The hypnotic calm of the night was shattered. His hand, suddenly steady, moved to the playback controls. The live feed froze, then began to reverse in a cascade of distorted pixels. He slowed the footage, advancing it frame by painstaking frame, his face illuminated by the cold light of the monitor. His heart beat a little faster, a nervous rhythm against the silent hum of the console. He was hunting for a ghost, a glitch in the machine, anything to explain the inexplicable. There was nothing. He watched the sequence a second time, then a third. The aisle remained perfectly still. No shadow, no blur, no sign of any presence. The only movement was the subtle digital noise of the low-resolution camera. He let out a slow breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It was a wave of relief, yet it felt incomplete. The absence of evidence was somehow more unsettling than if he had found a rat scurrying across the floor. The screen showed an unblemished reality, but his mind held the memory of its violation. He finally leaned back, shaking his head with a forced chuckle. Just the long hours getting to him, a simple trick of the light on a camera lens. A tired mind playing its familiar, foolish games. He tried to settle back into his familiar stupor, to let the drone of the machines lull him back into apathy. But now, his gaze was sharp, actively searching. The empty aisles on the monitors no longer looked peaceful. They looked watchful. And in the corner of his eye, on every screen, he thought he could almost see something moving, just out of focus. The following night offered no comfort. He arrived with a low thrum of apprehension already vibrating beneath his skin, a residue of unease that had stained the familiar silence. The coffee he brewed was stronger, hotter, a conscious effort to sharpen his senses rather than just endure the hours. Before settling into his chair, he made a meticulous check of the connections, running his fingers over the coaxial cables, ensuring every input was secure. He needed a baseline of logic, a reassurance that the system itself was sound, that any anomaly would be of the world, and not of the machine. It began subtly, as before, but with a new insistence. Not one fleeting shadow, but several. A fleeting shape in the hardware aisle, gone as soon as his eyes focused on monitor 4. A dark form that seemed to coalesce for a second behind the checkout counters on screen 1, only to dissolve into the ambient digital noise when he replayed the feed. They were like phantoms in the circuitry, present for only a single frame, taunting him with their impossibility. He found himself chasing them across the grid of screens, a frantic dance of attention, his initial anxiety curdling into frustration. These were no longer mere smudges or tricks of the light. They possessed a distinct, albeit transient, form. They were vaguely humanoid, possessed of a height and a gait that suggested a person, yet they moved with an unnatural fluidity, bleeding into the background as if they were made of smoke. He abandoned his logbook, his focus entirely consumed by the monitors. Each flicker of movement, each pixel that seemed out of place, was a potential threat, a new piece of a puzzle he couldn't comprehend. The vast, empty space of the supermarket no longer felt empty, it felt occupied by unseen, unrecordable things. Then, one of them stopped. On monitor 9, in the bakery section, a figure stood motionless before the refrigerated display of cakes. Unlike the others, it didn't vanish. It lingered, a dark, solid shape against the cheerful, frosted confections. It was perfectly still, its back mostly to the camera. The sight was profoundly wrong. The casual stillness of the form felt like a deliberate act, a performance for an audience of one. The silence in the security room deepened, and he could hear the frantic pounding of his own heart, a drumbeat against the hum of the electronics. His hand trembled slightly as he manipulated the controls, zooming in on the figure. The image degraded, dissolving into a coarse mosaic of gray and black pixels, but the form remained. He couldn't see a face, no distinguishing features. But there was something in its posture, in the slight slump of its shoulders and the specific angle at which it held its head, that resonated deep within his memory. It was a familiar silhouette, one he had seen 1,000 times in shop windows and mirrors, but not recently. It was a ghost from his own past. He felt a cold dread wash over him, a chilling recognition that defied all logic. The figure on the screen, shrouded in digital noise and shadow, stood exactly as he used to stand as a teenager. That same awkward, slightly insecure posture, the head tilted in a way he had long since corrected. It was him, a version of him from 20 years ago, inexplicably standing in the bakery aisle of a deserted supermarket in the middle of the night. The thought was so absurd, so utterly insane, that he felt a bubble of hysterical laughter rise in his throat, but it died before it could escape. He violently shook his head, pushing his chair back from the console as if it were radioactive. It was a hallucination. It had to be. The result of too many sleepless nights, too much cheap coffee, and the crushing, monastic solitude of the job. His mind was projecting, creating patterns from the static, dredging up old memories and plastering them onto the screen. He stood up and paced the small room, rubbing his temples, forcing himself to breathe deeply. He was the guard. He was in control. It was just a faulty camera, or a tired brain. But the explanation felt hollow, a thin shield against a terrifying truth. He forced himself to look back at the monitor. The figure was gone. The aisle was empty, pristine, exactly as it should be. He rewound the footage again, searching for the moment it had appeared, the moment it had vanished. There was no trace. The recording was clean. It was as if the figure had been edited out of existence, leaving behind only the memory of its presence in his mind. The absence was now more frightening than the appearance had been. He spent the rest of the night in a state of heightened paranoia, his eyes darting between the screens, searching for a recurrence. The other fleeting shadows continued their silent patrol of the aisles, their presence now feeling less like random glitches and more like a coordinated effort to distract and disorient him. He saw a shape that resembled a small child by the candy display, and another that looked like an old man shuffling through the pharmacy section. Each one was a new assault on his sense of reality, a new crack in the foundation of his sanity. He tried to rationalize it again. Perhaps there was a technical explanation he was missing. A crossed signal, bleeding through from some other source. A sophisticated prank by one of the day shift workers. He clung to these possibilities, turning them over and over in his mind, trying to make them fit. But none of them could account for the chillingly personal nature of the main apparition. None of them could explain why the ghost in the machine wore his own, younger self as a disguise. It was a violation that felt intimate and deeply malicious. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the high windows of the supermarket, the activity on the screens subsided. The shadows retreated with the night, leaving him alone once more in the humming silence of the security room. But the peace they left behind was a fragile one. He felt watched, not by the cameras, but through them. The seed of anxiety that had been planted the night before had not just been sown, it had taken root, and he could feel its cold tendrils wrapping themselves around his mind, pulling him down into the dark. The boundary between the world and its digital reflection had begun to fray, its edges bleeding into one another like ink on wet paper. Each new shift was a descent into a more profound state of dissonance. He no longer arrived with apprehension, but with a grim, surgical focus. He had started a ritual. Upon entering the sterile quiet of the security room, he would first walk a full patrol of the store, touching the shelves, feeling the cold glass of the freezer doors, anchoring himself in the tangible reality of the place before surrendering to the ghostly theater of the monitors. The true schism began on the third night after he had seen his younger self. It was no longer a ghost of the past that haunted the screens, but a specter of the present. He was sitting perfectly still, his eyes locked on the console, when Monitor 3 displayed a new, impossible image. It showed him, the man he was now, in the same uniform, with the same tired lines around his eyes, getting up from the chair he was currently occupying. He watched, frozen, as the figure on the screen stretched, walked out of the security room, and headed down aisle 4 with a steady, purposeful gait. He instinctively looked down at his own hands, clenched on the arms of his chair. He felt the worn fabric beneath his fingers, the solid weight of his own body. He was here. He had not moved. Yet, the feed showed him disappearing into the employee stockroom at the far end of the building. The small television screen presented an alternate reality, a branching path his life had taken in another dimension, playing out in grainy black and white. He was in two places at once, and the version of him that was real was the one that felt like a ghost. The night deepened, and the divergences grew more aggressive, more chaotic. While the supermarket itself remained an abyss of perfect silence, the world within the monitors convulsed. On screen 6, the overhead fluorescent lights in the dairy aisle began to flicker with a frantic, seizure-inducing rhythm, yet the actual lights hummed with their usual placid, steady glow. He watched as a pyramid of canned goods on screen 2 vibrated violently, then collapsed into a messy heap, the digital representation of tin clattering silently against linoleum. He listened intently, but the real world offered no corresponding sound, only the hum of electricity. The performance on the screens grew more elaborate. It was a poltergeist trapped in the circuitry, a malevolent force that could manipulate the recorded image but not the physical object. Bags of chips puffed and burst open in silent explosions of air and foil. The automated glass doors at the main entrance slid open and shut for unseen customers. It was a phantom ballet of chaos, a storm confined to the pixels of his monitors, while he sat in the calm, silent eye of it all, a helpless spectator to the unraveling of his own perceived reality. His attention was a frantic, panicked thing, flitting from one screen to another, trying to process the simultaneous, contradictory streams of information. His own senses told him everything was normal, that the store was asleep and undisturbed. But the cameras, the infallible, objective eyes of the machine, showed a world descending into madness. He was caught in the middle, his own mind the battleground where these two realities fought for dominance. The question of which was real began to lose its meaning. Both were happening. He was experiencing both at once. Then came the most terrifying moment of all. While his eyes were drawn to a particularly violent outburst on screen 11, where the televisions in the electronics department all switched on at once, displaying a blizzard of static, a flicker of movement on the camera feed from inside his own room caught his attention. It was monitor 16, the one pointed at his own back. He rewound the feed a few seconds, his breath catching in his throat. There, in the deep shadows of the corner behind his chair, something was moving. It was not one of the clear apparitions from before. It was a shape of indeterminate density, a man-shaped patch of deeper darkness that seemed to peel itself away from the surrounding gloom. It had no features, no substance, just a wavering silhouette that absorbed the already faint light. He watched on the screen as this dark figure took a slow, deliberate step towards his seated form, its movements unnervingly fluid. His blood ran cold. He could feel the empty space behind him, the cool air on his neck. He knew, with absolute certainty, that if he turned around, he would see nothing. The urge to turn was a physical, screaming need, a primal instinct to confront the threat. But he couldn't. His body was paralyzed by the paradox. The screen told him a monster was inches from his back, while his senses told him he was alone. To turn would be to capitulate to the illusion, to admit that the phantoms on the screen had more power over him than the solid world he occupied. To not turn was to sit in silent, abject terror, trusting his own fallible senses while the electronic eye showed his imminent doom. He remained frozen, his gaze locked on monitor 16. He watched the dark figure lean over his on-screen counterpart, its formless head hovering just beside his own. It was a moment of impossible, intimate horror. The silent chaos in the store continued to play out on the other 15 screens, a cacophony of madness that served as the soundtrack to this single, silent, terrifying act. The line between reality and the recording was gone. It was no longer a nightmare he was watching. It was a nightmare he was in, and the screen was the only window showing him the truth of it. He came to work on the fifth night not with fear, but with a kind of numb resignation. The battle for his sanity felt like a losing one, and the lines had blurred to the point of meaninglessness. He had stopped trying to differentiate between the real and the recorded, both were his reality now, a waking nightmare shared between his eyes and the 16 glowing screens. He moved with the slow, deliberate motions of a man walking on a crumbling cliff edge, where any sudden movement might send him plunging into the abyss of total madness. His coffee sat untouched, its warmth a trivial comfort against the profound cold that had settled deep in his bones. His strategy had changed. He no longer chased the phantoms on the screen, trying to debunk them with playback and analysis. Instead, he tried to ground himself, to find an anchor in the physical world. Before his shift, he had walked the length of the main aisle and placed a single, bright red apple on the pristine white floor of the dairy section, directly in the camera's view. It was a beacon of truth, a solid, unambiguous object. He would watch it, and if it moved or vanished on the screen while remaining on the floor, he would know. He would have his proof. But the screens offered a different kind of chaos tonight. They were quiet. The manic energy of the previous shifts was gone, replaced by a subtle, creeping wrongness. The shadows in the corners of the feeds seemed darker, the digital noise coalesced into vaguely organic patterns, and the faces of the mannequins in the clothing department seemed to be turned at slightly different angles every time he looked away and then back again. It was a quieter, more insidious form of torment, a psychological game of inches that was slowly, methodically eroding his last reserves of strength. It was then that he heard it. A sound. Not from the speakers that piped in the tinny audio feed from the shop floor, but from the world outside his soundproofed room. It was a faint, metallic scrape, followed by a soft click, coming from down the main corridor that led to the administrative offices. It was a sound of substance, of weight and friction, a sound that belonged to the physical world he had been so desperate to cling to. It was the first real, unexpected event to happen outside the monitors in days, and it cut through his paranoid trance like a shard of glass. For a moment, he remained utterly still, listening. The hum of the console was the only sound in the room, but he strained his ears for a repetition from the hallway. Silence. Had he imagined it? Was his exhausted mind now creating auditory hallucinations to complement the visual ones? But this had felt different. It had been sharp, definite. It was a signal, an anomaly that existed outside the cursed loop of his screens. A surge of adrenaline, purer than any fear the monitors had induced, propelled him to his feet. He was not a passive observer anymore. He was a guard, and something was in his store. He moved out of the room with a stealth he didn't know he possessed, his soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished concrete floor. The vast, cavernous space of the supermarket was even more intimidating without the mediating filter of the cameras. The towering shelves were monolithic slabs in the gloom, and the ambient security lights cast long, distorted shadows that writhed and danced at the edges of his vision. Every rustle of his own uniform, every quiet breath, seemed to echo in the profound silence. He was walking through the very scenes that had tormented him, now rendered in 3 dimensions. He followed the corridor, his hand trailing along the cold, painted brick of the wall. The sound had come from the direction of the main server room, a small, windowless closet that housed the brains of the building's network and security infrastructure. As he drew closer, he saw it, a thin, almost imperceptible line of pale light leaking from beneath the door. Someone was in there. The realization did not bring fear, but a strange, clarifying focus. Ghosts and digital apparitions were one thing, a physical intruder was a problem he knew how to solve. He pressed his ear to the cool metal of the door. He could hear a faint, rhythmic clicking, the sound of someone typing on a laptop or a portable device, and the low whir of a cooling fan that was not part of the room's standard equipment. He crouched down, peering through the small gap at the bottom. He could see a pair of scuffed work boots and the tangled mess of several cables snaking across the floor, leading from the main server rack to a small, dark object with a single, blinking blue light. An external hard drive. A wave of understanding, so powerful and sudden it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. The disparate, terrifying pieces of the last week slammed into place, forming a single, coherent, and utterly mundane picture. The flickering lights, the falling objects, the figures in the aisles, the impossible image of himself walking the halls, it wasn't a haunting. It was a feed. A pre-recorded, manipulated, and edited video feed being piped directly into his console. It was a prank. A vicious, elaborate, and psychologically devastating prank. The cold dread that had been his constant companion for days evaporated in a flash of pure, white-hot rage. The fear was gone, replaced by a burning, righteous fury. He had been tormented, pushed to the brink of insanity, not by a supernatural force, but by a human being. A colleague. The sheer cruelty of it, the calculated effort to make him doubt his own mind, was breathtaking. He was not going crazy. He was being gaslighted by a monster of flesh and blood, and that was a monster he could fight. He didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. He threw his shoulder against the door and burst into the room. Hunched over a small laptop connected by a nest of wires to the server was his replacement, the quiet kid who worked the day shift. The kid's head snapped up, his eyes wide with the panicked, guilty look of a cornered animal. The laptop screen was filled with video files and editing software, the tools of his psychological warfare laid bare in the stark, clinical light of the server room. The kid yelped, a pathetic, startled sound. He scrambled backwards, his chair screeching against the floor. His hands moved in a frantic blur, ripping the cables from his laptop and the external drive. He didn't offer an explanation, no apology, no justification. He just shoved the equipment into a backpack, his movements clumsy with panic. He saw the rage on the guard's face, a silent, murderous promise, and it was enough. The kid bolted for the door, pushing past him and sprinting down the dark corridor without a single word. He stood alone in the sudden silence of the server room, his chest heaving. The blinking blue light of the disconnected hard drive was gone. All that remained was the steady, green glow of the server's own status indicators, a symbol of a reality restored. The tension that had held his muscles in a permanent, rigid clench for days began to drain away, leaving him feeling hollow and shaky. He looked at the dangling cable, the tangible proof of the deception, and a single, ragged laugh escaped his lips. It was over. His walk back to the security room was a victory march. The shadows were no longer menacing entities, they were just an absence of light. The towering shelves were just shelves, laden with sleeping products. The silence was no longer a canvas for his fears, but a peaceful, welcome emptiness. He felt foolish, profoundly so, for having been so completely taken in. But beneath the embarrassment was a deep, powerful current of relief. He was sane. The world was solid and logical again. The ghosts had been exorcised. He slumped back into his chair, the worn fabric feeling like a throne. He looked at the bank of monitors, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they showed him the truth. 16 silent, motionless, and blessedly empty scenes of a closed supermarket in the middle of the night. The peace was absolute. The storm had passed. He finally reached for his coffee, the cold liquid a grounding, real sensation against his tongue. The profound, bone-deep exhaustion of the ordeal finally settled over him, and he closed his eyes, savoring the simple, beautiful quiet. The sweet, intoxicating relief was a physical sensation, a warmth spreading through his chest and uncotting the muscles in his back and shoulders. He felt light, almost giddy. The world had snapped back into its logical, predictable shape, and he was once again its sole, sane observer. He let his head fall back against the top of the chair, a long, slow sigh of air leaving his lungs, carrying with it the last vestiges of the paranoid tension that had held him hostage. The quiet of the room was a balm, the steady hum of the console a lullaby. He was free. His hand reached for the phone on the console, his fingers hovering over the keypad. A call to the station manager was in order. He would have to explain the security breach, the unauthorized access to the server room. He began to mentally rehearse the conversation, imagining the manager's sleepy, irritated voice on the other end of the line. The thought of the prankster, the day shift kid, brought another flash of anger, but it was a clean, manageable anger, not the formless dread he had been swimming in. It was a human problem, with human consequences. As he began to dial the number, his gaze drifted lazily across the bank of monitors, a final, cursory check born of ingrained habit rather than any real concern. His eyes swept over the familiar, static scenes, the empty aisles, the silent checkouts, the darkened deli counter. Everything was exactly as it should be, a perfect, boring tableau of a sleeping supermarket. His eyes moved past screen 9, 10, 11. It was a valedictory glance, the look of a captain confirming his ship was sound after a violent storm. The world was blessedly, beautifully normal. Then his eyes fell on monitor 12. The casual glance sharpened into a stare of disbelief. The warmth of relief was instantly extinguished, replaced by a deep, penetrating cold that was far more terrifying than anything he had felt before. The screen showed a view of the far corner of the main warehouse, a cavernous space stacked high with pallets of merchandise. And in the middle of that empty, concrete floor, stood a figure. It was him. Not a smoky silhouette, not a blurry apparition from his youth, but his exact, perfect duplicate, wearing the same uniform, with the same face. But this version of him was not calm. It was not experiencing relief. The figure on the screen was a puppet of pure terror. Its arms were flailing wildly, hands beating against the air as if trying to push away some unseen assailant. Its head was thrown back, mouth wide open in a silent, agonizing scream that contorted its features into a mask of raw, primal panic. It was a silent movie of ultimate desperation, a broadcast from a private hell. He was watching himself being tortured, and he could not hear the screams. He dropped the phone. It clattered onto the console, the sound unnaturally loud in the suddenly oppressive silence. His own body was a statue of ice, his breath frozen in his lungs. He was here, sitting in his chair, his heart a frantic, panicked bird against his ribs. And he was there, on the screen, in the warehouse, in the throes of an unspeakable horror. The two realities existed simultaneously, a paradox made manifest in grainy black and white. This was not a recording. The prankster was gone. The system was clean. This was live. A single, terrifying thought cut through his paralysis. The prank had not been the main event. It had been a distraction. A complex, cruel piece of misdirection designed to make him believe he had found a rational explanation for the impossible. The kid with the laptop wasn't the monster, he was a fool, perhaps even a pawn. The real horror had been waiting patiently behind the curtain of that logical explanation, waiting for him to lower his guard, waiting for him to feel safe, just so it could show him this. So it could show him the truth. He stared at the screen, at the frantic, screaming version of himself. Was that him? Was that the real him, trapped in the warehouse, his consciousness somehow projected into this room, into this body, forced to watch his own suffering? Or was he the real one, and the thing on the screen was something else entirely, a doppelganger, a mimic, an entity wearing his face as it performed its dance of terror for his benefit alone? The questions spiraled in his mind, each one more sanity-shredding than the last, eroding the very concept of self. He looked at his own hands, resting on the console. They were steady, pale under the lamplight. He could feel the cool plastic of the desk, the soft fabric of his uniform. He was solid. He was here. He slowly turned his head, his neck stiff, and looked towards the door of his room. He was safe inside this small, brightly lit box. But on the screen, his other self was now on its knees, hands clasped over its head, its body convulsing with silent, racking sobs. A wave of profound, empathetic agony washed over him. He was watching himself break. The relief he had felt only moments ago was now the cruelest part of the entire ordeal. It had been a false summit, a brief moment of sunlight before the true, endless abyss had opened up beneath him. This was not a prank. This was not a haunting. This was something else. Something worse. A fundamental law of the universe had been broken, and he was the sole witness to its violation. He sat in the quiet security room, a silent observer watching a silent scream, and the two realities, the calm and the chaos, were both his, and he was trapped between them. The paralysis was absolute, a state of being that went beyond mere fear. He was a statue carved from frozen dread, his consciousness trapped between two irreconcilable points of existence. In one, he was a man in a chair, bathed in the sterile light of a security room, his heart a frantic drum against the cage of his ribs. In the other, he was a figure of pure agony on a distant screen, a silent effigy of his own terror. The connection between them was a taut, invisible wire, and he could feel it vibrating with a terrible, resonant frequency, threatening to shatter the very foundation of his mind. The air in the room grew thick, heavy, as if the silence itself had mass and weight. The low, constant hum of the console, his companion through countless lonely nights, seemed to fade, leaving a profound, ringing emptiness in its place. He could feel the blood pounding in his ears, a desperate, internal rhythm against the encroaching void. His gaze was fixed on the 12th monitor, on the weeping, broken form of his doppelganger. It was a macabre feedback loop, his terror fed the image, and the image's despair radiated back into him, amplifying his own horror until he felt his sanity fraying like old rope. Then, without a flicker or a warning, every screen went black. All 16 of them. The sudden plunge into near-total darkness was a physical blow, a sensory deprivation so complete it felt like a door slamming shut on the world. The only light remaining was the single, dim bulb overhead, casting his immediate surroundings in a sickly, jaundiced glow. The rest of the room, and the world beyond it, had ceased to exist. He was adrift in a small, yellowed bubble of reality, surrounded on all sides by an abyss of dead screens. The silence was now absolute, a perfect vacuum. A single, eternal second passed. It was a moment of pure, suspended dread, a breath held in the lungs of the universe. In the darkness, he was alone with his own frantic heartbeat, the only proof that he was still alive. He didn't know if he preferred the impossible images to this profound, waiting emptiness. The darkness was a canvas, and his terrified mind was already beginning to paint its own horrors upon it, things far worse than the screens had ever shown. The anticipation was a form of torture in itself, a slow, agonizing tightening of a knot in his soul. And then, as one, they returned. Not with their previous scenes, not with the familiar, static views of the empty store. Every single monitor, all 16 of them, flickered to life to display the exact same, identical image. It was a close-up. An extreme, claustrophobic close-up of a human face, pressed so near to the camera lens that the features were distorted by the proximity, the skin stretched and warped at the edges of the frame. It was his face. It was his own face, staring back at him from 16 different angles, a hall of mirrors reflecting a single, shared moment of ultimate horror. The eyes were the first thing he truly saw. They were his eyes, but they were not his. They were wide, stretched to their absolute limits, the irises shrunk into tiny, black pinpricks in a vast, stark white field of sclera. They were not looking at the camera, they were looking through it, through the glass and the circuitry, directly into him. And they were filled with a terror that was not human. It was a primal, cosmic fear, the terror of a soul that has looked directly into the abyss and seen the abyss look back. It was the face of a man who had seen the engine of reality and had been broken by the sight of it. The skin on the face was pale, slick with a sheen of cold sweat that caught the harsh, invisible light source. Every pore was a tiny crater, every nascent wrinkle a deep, dark canyon. A single, perfect bead of sweat traced a slow, deliberate path from the hairline, down the temple, and to the edge of the jaw, its journey magnified across 16 screens. But it was the mouth that held the final, unspeakable horror. His own lips, chapped and bloodless, were pulled back from his teeth in a grimace that was not a smile, not a snarl, but a rictus of pure, unadulterated madness. And the lips were moving. They formed silent, desperate shapes, a frantic and repeated motion. It was a whisper, a secret being shared from the other side of the glass. He could see the faint, almost imperceptible puff of condensation on the lens with each movement, a ghostly breath from a phantom lung. He tried to read the lips, his mind frantically trying to assemble the shapes into a word, a warning, a plea. But the movements were too fast, too erratic, the silent message lost in the sheer, overwhelming terror of the face that was delivering it. He was no longer looking at a screen. The boundary was gone. The image had reached out and enveloped him, his entire reality now circumscribed by the 16 identical windows into his own damnation. He felt a scream building in his own chest, a physical, tearing need to vocalize the horror that was flooding his senses, but his throat was locked, his muscles turned to stone. His body was a prison, and his mind was forced to bear witness. The face on the screens was his own, and he knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that this was not a reflection. It was a destination. He was trapped in the unblinking gaze of his own terrified face, a gaze that promised an eternity of this single, silent, screaming moment. The silent whisper continued, a frantic, unheard prayer or curse. The urge to break eye contact, to turn his head, to throw himself away from the console and flee into the physical darkness of the store was a supernova of instinct within him. But the gaze held him fast, a hook sunk deep into his soul. He remained frozen, a fly caught in the amber of a moment, unable to look away, unable to process, unable to know if he would ever have the chance to turn.